Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss back here with another recap video. Today I'm going to recap today, Friday, September 18th, the last day of the week, the first full week of the ecology unit. Today we talked about a few things. We got to see a graph of the day and a 5-minute focus on a researcher who studies coral reefs in Curacao. So that was just to kind of generate some interest with the students, and there was a little bit of relevancy to what we had talked about with human impact and a positive message about regeneration of ecosystems that get protected. In fact, there was even a little trophic pyramid in there, so we got a reminder about a trophic pyramid. But the real work for today was to practice graphing and really to focus on interpreting predator-prey graphs. So I'm going to go and share my screen with a little bit of what we talked about today. And a little bit of the work today was in actually how do you make a graph like this in Notability? So this was the in-class work we did today, Ecology in-class practice number 4, and that's listed in Canvas under today's work in the calendar, and you can follow the link to this and bring it on over into Notability like we've been doing. And while a lot of the work was in creating this graph, I'm not going to show that in this recap video. While it's really important, it's not something we're going to be actively testing on, and we'll have a chance to practice those skills a little bit more as we go out. It's really interesting, and maybe we'll create a separate video about how to do graphing in Notability if you miss that today. The important part here is what we were looking at was actual data from 2000 to 2010 with wolf and elk populations in northeastern Minnesota. So these are actual data that were collected by the Fish and Game Department in Minnesota. And we're going to graph these here to try to interpret a little bit and see in real life what a predator-prey relationship might look like. So what we did is we brought these data here, we cut them out, and we dragged them down here so that we could see them a little bit better. And we made, for this particular graph, you see the little blue dot, we made the wolf population blue and the elk population red. And in fact, we actually created a key here because that's just a good practice when you're making a graph. And then we plotted these data. In 2000, there were 10 wolves, while there were 2,000 elk, so we're up here. And that gets to the first thing that I want to draw students' attention to here, is that in this predator-prey graph, along the x-axis here is the year from 2000 to 2010. And that's pretty typical of our predator-prey graphs, where time is along the x-axis there. And with a population like elk and wolves, we usually measure that in years. And then we're back to this interesting concept that we got introduced to yesterday, where you can have two y-axes so that you can plot two things that have very different amounts on the same graph. And what we see here is on the left-hand y-axis, we're plotting the number of elk. And you can see the number of elk is measured in thousands, right? So from 1,500 all the way up to 2,500. And the right-hand y-axis is the number of wolves. And that goes from 10 to 30, right? So while in this region right here, the graph for wolves is higher than, or the line for wolves is higher than the line for elk. That does not mean, that there are more wolves, right? So you can see it's about 19 wolves, whereas it's about 1,550 elk, right? So it can be a little deceiving, but you just have to remember that. We're looking more towards trends. And that gets us to our one point that we'll remember from this, from our major points from interpreting a predator-prey relationship, is there are always way more prey than there are predators. And that gets back to what we were talking about yesterday with that trophic pyramid in the day's prior to that, where as you move up the pyramid from producers to consumers, as you move up, there are fewer and fewer organisms up there. So that was one thing we noticed. We also noticed that these prey generally go through these sort of cycles. And while this graph ended at 2010, we could probably imagine, if we were collecting data up there, that with food population increasing, that the prey population might increase, and that this cyclical pattern would go on. Same would happen for wolves, because the predator responds to the population of prey, because that is the food for the predator. And we see that here, where the peak for elk happened in 2002, whereas the peak for wolves happens in 2004. And that's what we talked about yesterday, is that the predator population lags behind the prey population. It sort of mirrors it and parallels it, but it happens a little bit later. It's pushed over. And that makes sense, right? We talked about this yesterday, is that you can't have the predator population increase without the food supply, right? So the food supply needs to increase more for the predators to eat, and then their population can increase. And that's really the major takeaways that we wanted to have happen today. And we see one thing that we didn't see before is this region of kind of equilibrium, where the prey kind of stay the same and predators stay the same. So we might have a place where the ecosystem is in balance at this point. We answered some of these questions down here. What happened to the elk population? Well, it went up and then it went down. Same thing for the wolf population. It went up and then down. That's what we talked about. And what relationship did you see between the elk and wolf populations? Well, that's what we were talking about here, is that the wolf population sort of lags behind the elk population. And then it says during the winter months of 2002 to 2003, there was a huge blizzard that swept through the Midwest. And what do we think happened to the elk population from that blizzard? Well, 2002, the elk population was at its peak. But when that blizzard hit, the elk population started going down. And who knows what happened there? Is maybe there was, it happened in the early spring months when things were just about to start blooming. Food was covered up, or maybe some plants had started to bloom and the frost killed them. So we can imagine that maybe there was not enough food for the elk at this time. In addition, one of our bio teachers pointed out the fact that wolves are much better at predators at hunting in the snow than elk are at navigating and getting away in the snow. So this might have presented a ripe opportunity for wolves to take down more elk through predation. And in fact, we went up here, and that's exactly what plays out in this graph here. So starvation in 2002 and 2003 started going up for elk, as like if the food supply was gone, and predation went from 640 to 880. Predation started going up as well. So both of those are probably reasons why the elk population decreased. And then we see in 2006 through 2010, all of the elk that died from predation. None of them starved between 2006 and 2010. Well, why could that be? Well, if you look at this graph here, the elk population is relatively low for this 10-year period. And that could have been a time where the food supply had started regenerating a little bit. And with a lower elk population, there's plenty of food, right? The foliage responded quickly after that blizzard event, right? The next year, it's already probably growing back. Whereas the elk population, maybe there were fewer births during then, was on a decrease. So there were very few elk and probably a lot of food to eat. So the only ones that were dying were dying due to predation. And then finally, the final question we didn't have time for in class, but gets at kind of a moral question of what nature existing in a balance, and is it better for an animal to die by predation versus starvation? And that moral question could have implications in like how you allocate hunting licenses, right? Is it if it's really bad for animals to be starving, if morally you're opposed to that, maybe you're more in favor then of an increase in the amount of hunting for a particular species so that they don't succumb to starvation. But we didn't have a chance to talk about that in class, but it's an interesting moral conversation to have. So that's back to it, interpreting predator-prey graphs. That's one thing we're going to be assessing on the test. And I hope that made sense to you all. And it's Friday, so enjoy your weekend. I'm going to go enjoy mine. And just a reminder that Monday is an asynchronous day of learning. There's material for you to engage with, but there's not going to be a live Zoom. And we'll see you all back on Tuesday, the 22nd, for a live Zoom. So bye-bye, everybody.